Thank you for joining for this episode of the TechSpective Podcast. My guest this episode is Bill Mann. So, Bill, if you want to give a little bit of background on yourself.
Hey, good morning, Tony. Yes, my name is Bill Mann. I'm CEO of a company called Styra. We're an authorization company. Fundamentally, at the high level, we all know what authentication is, who a person is. We are focused on what a person or a service can do. And this is all built with an open source project called Open Policy Agent that we created and we maintain.
Okay. And I think that's an interesting distinction as well. I mean, authentication, there's a lot of identity and access management, authentication type stuff in general. But the focus on the what you can do is interesting. There, in a report you guys, I think it was a report you guys had recently, there's a stat that said that 70% of CISOs believe that open source is the path to faster security. Now, I've had many conversations over the years about kind of the pros and cons of open source when it comes to security, and for a lot of years I was on the sort of anti open source side, where I was more on the side of feeling like the fact that it's open means that anyone can just go look at the source code, find the vulnerabilities, and so it's just it makes it easier to find the vulnerabilities. But I've since come around. Like I understand the other side of the fence. That said, I think there are still issues on the pro side. The idea is, well, because it's open source and it's everyone can see the source code, then the vulnerabilities will ostensibly get identified more quickly and addressed because anyone can do it. But there's also always this sort of assumption that someone's doing it. Like no one actually has responsibility. Like you can't point to someone and say, well, why didn't you fix that? So I see it a little bit of both. And so to come back to this, so 70% of CISOs believe open source is the path to faster security, but there are also reports out there that cite vulnerabilities in open source code as one of the biggest challenges to security. And you look at things like Log4j, where companies that are using Apache, that's easy. They can say, oh, we're actually using Apache, so that affects us. But the thing with open source code is, a lot of times you're not using the whole project. You're not using the whole thing. You're using snippets and components of it that are embedded, 3 layers deep in some other program or application that you're running. So I think a lot of companies don't even know what open source code they're running. So all of that is a very long-winded way for me to get to just asking you your opinion. Is open source good or bad for security?
Yeah, well, ultimately, I do believe that it's good for security, and it's based on several kind of factors, and it's also a realization that we're not there today either, right? I mean, even in the closed software world that we can contrast open source to, it's not there either, right? We hear vulnerabilities on a regular basis from closed software companies, right, up and down the stack, right? So it's not the point I'm making is, open source is not there either, but the opportunity for open source to get there in terms of the level of risk that we want to be able to achieve with an organization, it's actually possible with that model of open source. The fact that, and you cited it, the fact that it's open source and you can look at it and there's a set of people around the globe that are looking at it and maintaining it gives it that credibility. Now, one of the things that you said, which was, anybody can, you don't know if anybody's going to fix it and so forth, right? To a certain degree, that's true, but it's not true for the well-managed, governed projects, right? So one of the things, and maybe you know this already, but one of the things I learned as I entered the open source space, so I came from the classic enterprise B2B security space. And, when I joined the company as CEO, this was my first open source company. And what I learned was, there's foundations like the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, which have a governance model, right? almost like a company, right? Where there's management, there's maintainers, there's contributors, there's a cycle of looking at vulnerabilities and so forth, right? And there's a lot of documentation as well. And our open source project, which is a graduated project from CNCF, meets those kind of criteria, right? So there is a governance model there are a set of people who work at companies, right, whose jobs, right, like, I've got folks in my company whose job is to make that open source project a successful project, right? So that does exist, right? But I think the other kind of parallel point here is, the question was really about, open source and security, but there's another thing that's happening, which is open source is inherently being used for building modern application stacks. Well, I mean, you can make the argument that, when we've been building on Linux, right, that's been open source for a long time, right? And that by definition. But that wave has just increased, extensively up and down the stack, right? So, the audience probably knows, there's a movement called Kubernetes now, right?
Right.
And based upon that movement, a lot of traditional organizations, right? I was at KubeCon, which is a cloud native conference a couple of weeks ago in Spain, and Mercedes-Benz was presenting right on stage and talking about how they needed to have a website which was showing their new model. They need to have a lot of innovation, and they set up themselves on Kubernetes several years ago. And that was a case study about how they're using Kubernetes. But Kubernetes, they chose it because it was an open source project. And then layered on top of that Kubernetes project is a set of other open source projects now, right? Service meshes and security projects, the Open Policy Agent. So that movement is happening in a big way. And what we find is every organization who's building software now is building software with a basis on open source. So then that leads to the question of security and open source and the need for getting better governance for those projects and so forth, right? Yes, I'm a stronger believer that model of having a large set of people looking at the code, right, is going to lead to stronger, more secure code, right? And I'm not saying there's never going to be any space for closed source. Of course, layered on top of it, just like my company does, many other companies, where we provide layers on top of that. But the basic engines, right, just like Linux was an engine for us, which sits underneath really, Mac OS and the Mac and the Apple Mac I'm using at the moment. The core components are going to be open source, and that's what I think where the industry is going. And there's a lot of interest in that model because it's going to de-risk the basic components of it, but it's not there yet, right? I mean, it'll be fooling anybody to say it's there at the moment.
Okay. Well, and I agree with you. You have open source. There are very large open source, projects. Kubernetes, one of them. Some of them I could think of like were open source and now they're not, which things like Nessus. But there are also just thousands of open source projects out there. Tens of thousands. And exactly. There's thousands of open source projects, and but there's very few of those open source projects that have gone through the kind of the graduation process, right? The vetting process and so forth. So like our project, Open Policy Agent, it's a graduated project, right? And to get graduation, it's not just like, a couple of tests here and there. You have to have large scale adoption within customer environments, right? You need to get feedback from those environments. It needs to be vetted from a security and a vulnerability perspective, right? You've got to have other vendors contributing to it. So no one single vendor owns the code, right? So we've got like 5,000 contributors to Opera at the moment. And that's a several year project of graduation, and most projects, I don't even get that far, right? So, and that's the point I'm making, right? That level of oversight from different companies which have got different agendas around the globe gives rise to a solid open source project, right?
And the ones that don't get there, well, they didn't pass that LAF test, right? No, I say LAF test, but that test from different organizations, right? Opera, for instance, is used by Google and Microsoft in their cloud native stacks, right? And it's used by a lot of other companies, VMware and so forth, right? So, and these companies don't go using that software as a core component unless it meets specific requirements which are specific for that organization for another one. We have a lot of we work obviously with the Opera community, and we see financial services, insurance, healthcare, all the verticals, right, adopting Kubernetes and then using us for the authorization component. Obviously, that's our only focus.
Okay. Well, and also, I didn't mean my line of questioning to be like an indictment of open source per se.
No. I think it's great to kind of talk about it, right? Because, and I personally find it exciting to talk about, because I didn't know this stuff myself when I joined the company as CEO, right? Because coming from the classic space.
Right. Well, and I was gonna say too that at this point I feel like it almost doesn't matter if if you're using an open source project, like a pure open source project, or you're buying proprietary software. There is like virtually guaranteed to be open source components involved. Like you almost can't not use open source on some level.
Yes.
But that first stat, that first question was around 70% of CISOs believing that open source is a path to faster security. But in general, so let's kind of step back from that. There for any organization that's developing applications and developing things, there's the competing need of agility and speed to market, trying to get there before your competition, and security. And traditionally, I feel like speed to market and agility are always the thing companies focus on first, and then someone goes, oh wait, we should secure that. So how do you think, like, how can CISOs effectively balance those two things, agility and speed to market, with the need for security at the same time?
Well, the way I think about it is, let's take an example that we're all familiar with now. Electric cars at the moment, right? Electric cars in the previous generation, we worried about the engine and the horsepower and what was under the hood. And now the generation of people who are buying electric cars are worried a lot about the software, the interface, and so forth. So software is basically the core kind of component of a lot of businesses now, right? You go to Home Depot, right? You can buy things from your phone, and you can track things and find where they are in the location and in the buildings, right? And so everything is software related now. So the point I'm making is software has become kind of like a key differentiating feature for anything that anybody wants to sell, right? Even in the banking arena, the new generation of folks who are using online banking accounts, they're looking for more secure banking accounts, right? They're looking for the banks that worry more about privacy and so forth versus, more traditional ones. So the point I'm making is, point number one is software has become a critical component of the product that most organizations sell, right? Rather than selling a car before, yes, it's a car, but the software is a large portion of that value proposition now. Now, with software getting features out to the market as fast as possible has been there since day one, right? And that balancing act, right, has shifted now because the entire world, right, especially the CISO community and the security community, they've learned a lot in the last 10 years in terms of privacy risk and breaches and so forth, right? And most people I talk to who are in software engineering and in the office of the CTO or anything around with risk and so forth, they get it, right? And they've almost had enough of the, okay, we're going to have our hands slapped again because we didn't think about it. Of course, we thought about security before, but the it was hard to balance, right, getting something out the door as fast as possible, right, to fixing the security. But that's changed now, and it's definitely changing now because software is a kind of a key component of it. People are understanding that, just like when you do autopilot on a Boeing 747, it's complex software. I mean, software is complex, right? So that is pulling the thought process back to let's get security right on day one. So the number of software engineers we speak to, and look, 10 years ago, remember the days when Microsoft and other large companies used to give everybody a book to say, let me teach software engineering about security, the importance of security. Engineers understand the importance of security. Absolutely. I mean, if anybody's using any social media, they understand, the risk of posting the wrong thing or privacy and so forth. So that's now bleeding into the generation of software engineers who actually want to build secure software from day one. They don't want to be told, hey, you guys didn't think about it afterwards. So the CISOs know this, and the CISOs are putting more emphasis on security earlier on in the development process, right? That this whole whole trend we've heard of shift left and so forth, right? So that's definitely happening. But my key point, it's happening because security has become now a key part of the product. If it wasn't, I think it would be still the same. But since everybody recognizes security is a key part of the product that they're offering, they know that product's got to work well. And the first thing that consumers are doing is, authenticating themselves to it, accessing it, and so forth, right? And that's what's leading to security being a higher priority, right, than before. And then that kind of leads itself all the way to the food chain, right? Which then leads itself to, CISOs saying, well, if we're going to be building security earlier on, then, it's got to be done right from the first place, right? And you've got, just like Kubernetes was a reinvention of, orchestration and deployment and so forth, you've got projects like Open Policy Engine, which are reinventions of how to do authorization in this environment, right? And when we think about policies, most of us think about, a PDF document this thick, and somebody puts it into their drawers and never looks at it again until next year, until somebody else wants to audit it, right? I mean, Open Policy Agent, changes that whole landscape to what we call policy as code, right? So you codify policy, just like you codified infrastructure with Kubernetes. So the model is extremely different now, and it fits into the automation cycle that everybody wants to have as well. Because, everything I've said, everybody wants to get things done faster. Well, they're getting it faster because of the workflow is also changed for software engineering. When I started my career, I had to do 2 or 3 releases a year, right? As an engineer, right? Now it's every 10 seconds if you want it to be, right? Because there's an automation process along there. And automation is great because you can check things along the way. But and with project like Open Policy Agent, you can also automate how you think about policy and how you think about testing of policies and so forth. So the overall, risk of the whole application starts to reduce because you've got a different way of thinking about it. And that is something I would just want to underline. It is a different way of thinking about it. This is not for legacy environments or retrofitting old stuff. It is like building a brand new home, right? Just like Tesla went ahead and said, okay, clean sheet of paper, we're going to build a different kind of car with a different chassis and a battery power. Where when we're talking to organizations, classic any organization building new applications, but they're building it with a clean sheet of paper, typically saying we're going to start with Kubernetes, we're going to have a DevOps workflow model, we're going to use OPA for the authorization, we might use a service mesh, right, like Istio or Envoy for microservices and so. It's a complete architectural change, right? But sometimes you have to change things, right, to make them better, right? And because most engineers will tell you, they want to move forward, but they can't move forward because of the architectural constraints of the previous application stack. And most organizations we talk to are kind of like saying, okay, we're building a new online banking application, or we're building a new healthcare application, etc.
Right. Well, so first of all, like, so I can relate on the historical way of doing the software releases, because when I was, in the trenches as a security engineer, like one of my roles was doing basically the security analysis of applications before they were launched to production. But but like you said, that was something we did 3 or 4 times a year. It was like a quarterly release cadence, and and you had definite cutoffs. Like, all right, well, if you didn't get your change in by XYZ date, it's not making the next release. And then now you're looking at waiting 6 months because you got to get through this cycle and the next one before you're going to see it in production. And obviously, a lot's changed. And to your point about cars, I would extend it not just cars, but things that we traditionally think of as even the data center, like servers, infrastructure, like all these things, like everything has been sort of virtualized into code. And so like, you're talking about policy as code, but it's, but like I said, you have servers as code, you've got infrastructure as code, everything is code. And obviously that changes things dramatically. I mean, like you say about cars, it's like, I'm from Detroit, got the hat. I grew up in Detroit. Obviously, a big car mentality there, and when you go there, like there do tend to be more older cars in Detroit. People like to work on their cars and stuff, but like the cars today, you can't really do that. It's hard. You can't really be like a hobbyist who likes to tinker with your car on the weekend, because you need a computer. Like you have to have the diagnostic computer to do anything with a car today. And something like a Tesla, or some of the other cars that some of the other manufacturers are working on now, it's really the car is the software, and the vehicle is just the platform the software is running on. And it's like it almost doesn't matter what the actual like physical hardware of the car is almost irrelevant. So all of that's very interesting, but it also talks about the evolution that you alluded to, which is that legacy way of, okay, we're going to do 3 releases a year, 4 releases a year, doesn't work anymore. That's why we have all of the automation. That's why we've gone from waterfall to agile to DevOps in terms of development mentalities. So, in your, I'd like your insight on like where we're at today. How does having a DevOps or DevSecOps mindset, help an organization be able to maintain that balance between speed to market and security?
Yeah, well, I think the mindset is the most important thing, right? Just having that mindset helps an organization kind of chart its path kind of moving forward. If it doesn't have the mindset of doing something slightly differently than what it's done before, it's never going to be able to move forward, right? And so that mindset can, as long as folks at the top of the organization understand that mindset, and they're asking the right questions, and they're putting the right kind of investment into making sure that they're getting, automation set up between the organizations. And look, nothing happens overnight in any organization, but that mindset is the most important thing. Knowing that there's a vision for the organization, that we want to be able to have updated releases of our software on a weekly or a monthly basis, right? And we want to implement automation throughout the process and want to do things earlier than later, right? That mindset, right? It's just words in the end, right? Like anything, these are just words in the end, right? But I find that organizations are still kind of working on that kind of old-fashioned model of let's do a quarterly sit down and look at our kind of high alerts that we've got reported on our sites and so forth, right? A lot of the meetings and the kind of the way we operate has to change, right? And it can come from the top with purely that mindset, right? The other thing about this mindset, and I think you probably can kind of relate to this as well, right? Is in the past, what I found was, platform architects and generally just architects within the organization, they knew what to do, right? They just didn't have a voice, right? And it was just too easy for somebody who had a suit and tie and somebody who was much more business inclined to say, it's okay, we're not going to listen to you. We're just going to buy this particular piece of software for, it solves a problem, it's cheaper or whatever, right? But what we are finding now is very clearly that the architects have a voice, right? And mostly it's because they're just so annoyed that they're having to deal with the crap from the previous projects that they worked on, right? They don't want to make the same mistakes again. So they have a strong voice, and they are strongly involved in how to architect these systems, right? And one of the things that I found actually very interesting 3 or 4 years ago, this is right, is when you go to the KubeCon conference or any of these conferences, and you compare those conferences like to the RSA security conference. The RSA security conference is mostly C-levels and senior people. But when you go to KubeCon, it's developers, DevOps engineers, platform engineers, and they are the ones with their fingers on the pulse. They're looking at the technology, they're using the technology. If they like it, they're going to like it. If not, they're going to try something else, right? So that bottom-up motion of using technology again, and hands-on with that technology is also the mindset that organizations want to encourage within their organization, because it's better to get a more secure application when you've got developers who know the tech stack that they want to use. They don't want to be forced into using any tech stack anymore. And I'm seeing that big time with larger organizations where the C-levels are saying, you know what, let the architects tell us the new tech stack they want to use, right? We want to make sure we can deliver on time. We want to have the innovation. It's got to be secure, because security is such an important part of our kind of offering now, right? And the architects are making those choices, right? Rather than before, what it was, a contract vehicle that was making the choice, right? So there's a lot of those kind of changes, and in the end, it's that kind of that mindset of the senior folks to say, look, I understand this, right? We are going to listen to. Versus the old, which is right, we're just going to make some corporate decisions on some technology without really considering what's real anymore, right? So and I think that's just an important kind of construct that I'm seeing now for the companies that are being very successful, and we've seen it across the board here, right? This is not any particular vertical. Everybody wants to do the right thing, right? And it's not that they didn't want to do the right thing before, but now they're listening to the people who can actually make a difference in the organization, right? So, I may sound very optimistic, but I spend a lot of time with developers and DevOps folks, and it's just not what people used to think 10 years ago, which is like, these guys don't have a clue about security. They do. They absolutely do. We all want to build stuff that is used by a lot of people, and it's secure, and it keeps the right people accessing the right information, the wrong people who don't, right? I mean, that's ultimately, we want to be able to do that.
Yeah, well, and I think in there, when you say, developers, the people who are doing these things, like they want to do the right thing, and they know, and they generally know what the right thing is. I feel like one of the things that has shifted in the last decade, which really needed to shift, is the top-down part. It's what's the pressure on you as a developer? Is the pressure to get the product out fast no matter what, or pressure to get the product out secure no matter what, or is it to find the right balance? And I think when I was doing security assessments on software, the mentality from the top, security wasn't in the picture. Like they didn't, that was an afterthought. They didn't care about that. They were, my job was to check a box to show that they did a security assessment, which always made me the bad guy, because then they're ready to go to production, and I'm the guy who has to go, oh no, you can't do that. And so I think, that part of that DevOps mindset and DevSecOps is not just in breaking down the silos between development and operations and security and sort of changing the culture of the way they work together, but it's making sure that from the board and the C-suite down, that they are also invested in this process, and that they are focused on and promoting the right things.
Yeah, well, I think you've seen that, and I won't give specific examples, but we've seen that with public companies having security issues and the stock price, going down. You've seen, lawsuits, from various organizations on the financial markets, basically saying, well, hold on, now you've just disclosed you didn't take the right kind of precautions from a security perspective. I've lost all this money, et cetera, et cetera. So even from a pure financial perspective, right, there's a correlation between, reduction in stock price to security incidences, right? Now, stocks also come back as well over a certain period of time. And I remember several years ago, there was a lot of debate about, the stock went down by 20%, but now it's back up to the same level. We don't have to worry about it, right? But I think that was kind of like, at a time, those kind of perspectives. But I think that, good CEOs at public and private companies just know the importance of security and how much relies on that security, right? Again, it all goes back to the fact that software, has become kind of a critical component of the offering that companies provide in the first place. If software wasn't, then I think, no, it wouldn't be that important, right? People can gloss over it and say it's important, but it wouldn't be that important. But since software is such a critical part of it, if you're driving an electric car and you can't get your downloads and can't have access to your car, right, because you don't even have a key anymore, you're done, right? It's crazy, right? And the same is true for everything else as well. And look, let's also just add on top of that the fact that we're in a social media, information travels extremely fast now, right? So when there is a vulnerability at your company, the market's going to know about it, right? The general public's going to know about it, and so forth. And it's very easy for consumers to move from one platform to another platform, right? Or it's becoming easier, right? From one bank to another bank. In Europe, in England, a couple of years ago, there was laws passed to make it very easy for a consumer to move from one bank to another bank, right? Transferring the money and so forth, right? A couple of clicks and so forth, right? So, that's a change that's happening, and certainly at the board level, they're understanding that. Some boards are even saying they're going to have somebody representing security and risk from a IT perspective on the board, right? So boards are kind of getting independent board members who can add that kind of perspective for the board and so forth, right? So I think we're just going through a good amount of change at all levels of the stack, at the C level, all the way down to the developer, right? In this movement, and I think we're going to be in a better place. It's that next evolution that the market needed, fundamentally, right? Markets have to change and we have to evolve, and that's what's happening at the moment, right? It's certainly, I think we're certainly trending in the right way. I was at the RSA security conference last week in San Francisco, and just started off after 2 years, and there's a lot of buzz around security, but it's a lot more around kind of automation and kind of like ground level security rather than the kind of like the dashboards and so forth, right? It's like trying to solve security at the lowest level. My company, we created Open Policy Agent because we wanted to rethink the way authorization was done in its entirety, right? Everything, prior to our company and this open source project was just another variation of something that was done. It needed a rethink, right? And just like infrastructure as code is a rethink to how we used to deploy, Linux infrastructure. I used to write scripts and so forth. And when I just sit in the data center, it's a rethink of, let me define the definition of something, and it's a YAML file that describes the description of this application, and let something else kind of take it over and deploy it, and it can be ephemeral. The same is the approach we're taking with policy, and we're making sure that you can have strong policy and policy constructs, right, for all the different parts of the stack, right? Why should you have to have a different way of doing policy for every single product that you use, every single technology you use? You can have the same authentication for everything. You can have the same logging for everything with technology like Splunk. You can have the same platform for everything with Kubernetes. Why not the same for policy? And that's why building an open source project is not a 6 month job. It's typically several years, right? and it to become a de facto standard, which is what OPA is. You can't do it on your own. You need the community. You need the participation of everybody in the community, both vendors and end customers who are using it, testing it, telling you what they don't like about it, and so forth. And that iteration is what leads to a successful open source project.
Okay. Well, all right. So I guess kind of my closing question or final question is sort of, when it comes to DevSecOps and that pipeline and the automation and stuff, do you have any recommendations, any guidance, best practices? Like, what should that pipeline look like? Like, what does it need to include for an organization to get that right?
Yeah, I think number one, it's implementing a CI/CD kind of, and I won't mention the vendors and so forth, but that model is what you want to implement within your organization, right? Because that model allows you to have the DevSecOps kind of workflow defined in your environment, right? So that's choosing and one of the many vendors out there, and picking one of those and implementing that is kind of critical. Then looking at the individual steps in that pipeline and implementing policy and controls at different layers of the stack, right, is critical, right? Because it's no use finding that you're just about to deploy an image into production right at the end stage, just before it gets deployed. Because if you could have scanned it earlier on with a vulnerability scanner and not inserted it into the yesterday's build, it would have been way better from a security point of view. So implementing policy at different layers of that stack, and all of these CI/CD platforms are all based on some level of open source technology, so it's very easy to plug in checks at different stages of that process, right? And certainly what we find is organizations are checking right at the end, just before Kubernetes gets deployed. Something's called a mission control. It's a last check, right? So let's check if this application meets the guardrail policies that we want. It hasn't got images that didn't come from the right repo, for instance, right? Something as simple as that, which is vulnerability scanning. And it's happening earlier on in the cycle as well, when developers, DevOps engineers are putting the new description of the application in, but checking it at different levels. So those are the two recommendations: picking an automation, workflow approach with CI/CD, and then implementing controls at different levels of that workflow. And obviously, the good thing about these controls are, DevOps engineers would know immediately in the tools that they are using if they're not meeting the policies of the organization, okay? And so they don't have to go to some other tools. They're going to be able to get the information in the tools that they're using. And that's what Shift Left is all about, so they can fix the problem before it gets to a problem later on. So that's my key recommendation, right, around this area. And I think that's where a lot of focus is going on for most organizations. You've heard the term software supply chain security, which is what I've just described there, right? Implementing that model for your organization is critical.
Okay.
And then ancillary to this stuff is the stuff that we all are very familiar with, like vulnerability scanning products, and there's lots of those things. But those are things that provide the information to the policy to make a decision. Okay, and that's the two recommendations.
Okay, I think that's a very, very good insight, and I definitely agree on the CI/CD side. In terms of when we talk about kind of automating the workflow, like that kind of is the foundation of that automation.
That's a foundation, right? I mean, and I answered it that way because workflows are. It's a vague term for most people. What does it mean? But ultimately, it means implementing one of these technologies and saying, okay, this is the process that you're going to have for inserting new code in and getting it out the door, right? And we're going to have tests at these points in the workflow. And look, I suppose the obvious thing is this is not what we used to do before, right? We never used to do before. What we used to do is once every 3 months do the one right at the end, right? But this is being done on an automated, continuous basis on a daily basis, right? And that's the thing. That's the way to de-risk an environment, right? Is to do it on an automated basis, no manual activities involved at all.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for joining me. And as we wrap, I wanted to just give you an opportunity. Like, where can people learn more about Open Policy Agent or more about Styra? What are some resources they can use?
Absolutely. Well, come to Styra.com. We have an free academy to teach the audience on what is authorization, how to use Open Policy Agent, and so forth. A lot of free education there, blogs and so forth. Also go to the Open Policy Agent website. Just do a search for Open Policy Agent. You'll see stacks of content there. So those are the two places to go and learn about this technology. And we are the company that created it, and we've built products, a cloud service on top of it to make it even easier to use. If you don't want to just start with open, what we're finding now is, as a project has matured, a lot of organizations, don't want to start with the pieces. They want to have more of a solution and a service to help them and move down the path. So come to us and check it out.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to join me. I think it was a great conversation, and important things for people to know in terms of getting secure code out the door quickly.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I appreciate you investing your time to listen to the podcast, but I also invite you to engage on social media. Please go like our Facebook page and follow at TechSpective on Twitter and Instagram. You can feel free to let me know what you like, let me know what you don't like, let me know if you love it, let me know if it sucks, and let me know what products you'd like to see reviewed or what questions you'd like to see answered in future posts.